with my co-host Jason Sunkel tonight, and we are jumping on to talk about not
We
a
are
whole lot of
officially in the
NBA news since
doldrums, Mike. We're in the doldrums.
there was not a lot of news to discuss. We could very briefly touch on the fact that it appears Zion may be in the best shape of his career. My 250 games played is I'm feeling pretty solid on that one in our little wager. And then our guy from France, Yershan Yabusele, signs with the Philadelphia 76ers. So good signing for Philly, obviously, and move on from there. We'll
Here's
see
our
what
news.
happens.
Here's
So
our news.
there's the news segment of the podcast. All right. Why don't Jay, you kind of introduce, this was your
So
idea, so why don't you kind of introduce the idea of this topic
yeah,
here?
so I said to Mike, we were trying to come up with a gimmick to talk about today because we really, like you said, didn't have anything to talk about. And we talked this morning, and then we hung up the phone, and then like 30 seconds later, I called Mike again. He probably was like, "What the heck is this bothering me for again?" And I said, "Oh, here's an idea. How about we talk about the most important player on every roster for the team in 5 years?" Now, I left it at that, Mike. I didn't say anything specifically. Like, does that mean could we talk about whether their person's on the roster still? Does it mean this person's retired? Is he injured? I left it wide open. And uh, so we're gonna kind of just go through each team. Now we're gonna focus on the Eastern Conference tonight. And then theoretically next week we'll do the Western Conference, obviously, unless um, some big time news happens, which I just don't see happening. But next week we would do the Western Conference. Does that sound like a good deal, Mike?
Sounds like a
Sound enough?
plan. Let's do
Okay,
it.
so we're gonna go through this, and we're gonna go through it by conference and by division. So we're gonna start with the Atlantic Division, and we're gonna start with the NBA champs, Mike, the team that we love to talk about the most on this podcast, the Boston Celtics. And the guy I'm going to go with is Jason Tatum, Mike. I picked Jason Tatum as the most important player 5 years from now on this roster. And here's what I wrote down. Is he finally the superstar we think he could be? Or will he always have the asterisk of not being as good in the moment, not being the guy that can deliver in the moment? That's really what it comes down to for me. Like, I think if 5 years from now, Boston is successful, Jason Tatum is the best player on the team, continues to be growing as a player, continues to get better. I mean, the only other possible answer that I could see would be Jalen Brown, but I had to feel I felt like I had to go with Jason Tatum as my guy in this
So there's
for the
two
first team.
there's 2 points to be made, I think, here. One, I would agree. I think Tatum is the guy that you'd have to look at as the most important player 5 years from now. I do think that we've analyzed Tatum's game endlessly here on the pod, and I still would maintain my position, which it seems like much more of the basketball world has sort of aligned itself with my ongoing opinion that Tatum is a cut below a top tier superstar. That's not to say that he's not a really good player. It's not to say that he hasn't had huge playoff games, but it is to say that when you start talking about a top 4 or 5 guy in the league who clearly is the best player on a championship team, Tatum this year won a championship, but was not in the final 2 rounds the best player on the team. Now, you can make an argument that maybe he's more skilled all around than Jalen Brown, but Brown won the Eastern Conference Finals MVP and then the NBA Finals MVP. So hard to argue with the fact that right now at this moment that Jalen Brown performed better in this Celtics playoff run. And yet at the same time, Brown's 1 year older than Tatum. I do think that when you look at it 5 years from now, seems at least semi unlikely. Although I guess if Jeff Bezos buys the Celtics, then money suddenly becomes no object. Not that it's not no object at this point, but I think the question with the Celtics is, are both of those guys on the Celtics in 5 years? And if I was betting, I would probably bet no. And I would think that if one guy or the other was to leave or was to be let go or to be not re-signed or however you want to phrase it, to me, I think that Tatum would be the guy that would stay, and Jaylen Brown would probably be the guy that would go. So yeah, I think I agree with you in this case. Tatum, most important player for the Boston Celtics.
All right. So 1 for 1, we're tied. We both agree. All right. The Brooklyn Nets. This is my note for the Brooklyn Nets. I don't know if anyone on this team will be on this team in 5 years.
That's fair.
Just
I mean,
looking at the roster. I mean, the theoretical player, the best player. If this roster, like someone was to stay, if I was the Nets, who would I want to be the guy? I guess Cam Johnson, probably. Right. I mean, Ben Simmons, maybe. If you're thinking that he's somehow going to miraculously play basketball at a constructive and effective level, but I mean, that's been 4 years, so I don't see that happening. So I, I mean, I've almost logged as many minutes as Ben Simmons has logged the last 4 seasons. So let's just put that to bed right now. I just don't see it. So I think it's probably Cam Johnson, but I don't think Cam Johnson is on this team in 5 years. So
35,
that's where I'm
35
at.
year old Dennis Schroeder. 35-year-old Dennis Schroeder.
No, come on, man. No.
So I think when you look at this roster, I think you're probably right that there's a good chance that there's not one guy from this roster that's still playing for the Brooklyn Nets 5 years from now. But I think there's probably three candidates. Ben Simmons is not a candidate. I mean, there's no way. First of all, even if he were to return to Brooklyn or to go anywhere after this contract is done, he is an unbelievable reclamation project that we've talked about him a lot, just like Tatum, that I don't see Simmons ever getting back to a level where he'd be a cornerstone guy. So then you're looking at essentially three youngish role players that could any of them progress to being the most important Brooklyn Net. Let's put it this way. If any of these three guys are the most important Brooklyn Net 5 years from now, then whatever rebuilding job they're trying to do has not really come to fruition. But to me, I think the candidates are Nick Claxton, Cam Johnson, and Cam Thomas. And each of them obviously plays a different role. Nick Claxton, rim running big, guy who's lanky, good defensive player, not a lot of bulk, maybe has a little bit of upside, but I think offensively always going to be limited. Cam Johnson is, I don't know if I would say he's an elite role player, but he's maybe just a slight tick below that. A very, very good role player, probably more valuable on a good team than he is on a bad team, like what this Brooklyn team is going to be this year. And then Cam Thomas, who, in all honesty, he might put up 25 a game this year for Brooklyn if they just let him take the ball and go do what he wants to do, which is shoot almost every time he touches it. So, look, I guess I'm going to go with Claxton only just to be different because I think that the sort of the genotype of what Claxton is always going to be a valuable player. You got a guy who can defend on one end and then run the floor, set screens, roll to the rim. I don't think any of these three guys are hopefully going to be key cogs 5 years from now for Brooklyn. But if I had to pick one, I guess I would go with Claxton.
Okay. I think we're going to agree on this one. The New York Knicks, I have to say Jalen Brunson. Does he continue to play at the high level that he's been playing, or is he going to be Isaiah Thomas 2.0, where he's going to have 2 or 3 good seasons, and then he's going to get injury ridden because he's so small? But I think he's proven over the 3 years he's going to do it. Although in the playoffs he got hurt and kind of fell apart, but I think he's probably the most important player in 5 years for the New York Knicks because if he's still playing at a high level, they probably are going to continue to attract, I don't want to say sidekicks for him, but other players for him and continue the ascension of the New York Knicks. I think he's probably the guy that has to be the most important in 5 years from now because
He's just young enough that you can make the case that 5 years from now he's 27, so In 5 years, Brunson's 32. I think the other guy that you would point to maybe if it's not Brunson because of those, again, health concerns and at his size, Mikal Bridges would probably be the other guy. I think if you went back to when Bridges first goes to Brooklyn and it looks like maybe he has the chance to develop into a number one option, that maybe you might take Bridges simply because of his size and his defensive versatility and what he can do. But I think as Brooklyn put more responsibility on him last year as the number one option, he kind of showed that that probably isn't his ultimate destiny. He's probably much better off in a situation like he is now with the Knicks, where he's one of a cast of characters. And he probably more so than Cam Johnson, who we talked about with the Nets, who were teammates back when they were in Phoenix. I think Bridges does fit the category of an elite role player. You can win an NBA championship if Mikal Bridges is one of your starters, depending upon what the rest of your starting five and your roster looks like. So it's pretty close for me between Brunson and Bridges, kind of for the reasons that you described, the hesitation that you might have with Brunson as a small guard, as somebody who maybe over the course of their career wears down. And by the time he's 32, is he nearly as effective? Whereas Bridges, with a little bit more size, maybe he's still playing at a high level. But I think based on current performance, I think you have to go with Brunson simply because of what he's done over the last two seasons. And also, it's sort of, I think, even if he's diminished in some way as a player, I do think that his leadership and just the fact that I think he's the driving force behind reuniting all these Villanova guys. It feels like even if he's lost a step as a player, that he's still going to be an important piece of what the Knicks are doing 5 years from now.
All right. Oops, sorry, I dropped my phone. Next person, Embiid or Philly. I have between two. I have Embiid. Is he still playing basketball? Is he healthy? Has all of his legs fallen off, Mike? Oh, the other guy would be Tyrese Maxey. I think if we're talking 5 years from now and the way that Embiid's career has gone, I think we can both make an argument that maybe he's still the same guy playing, 50, 60 games in a season. The argument that he's not that guy, he's too injury prone, makes 50 games but plays way less minutes, and Tyrese Maxey has to be the guy. I don't know where you're leaning on this, but those are the two that I'm between. But I'm probably going to go with Maxey. Has to be the guy at that point because Embiid's going to be old, and he's already proven that he can't stay healthy as a younger guy. So that's where I'm probably going to go as Tyrese Maxey.
Did you see the tweet? I think it was Embiid who put it out, or maybe somebody else tweeted it, of Embiid when he was still, I believe, in Cameroon before he came to the US to Canada, and how skinny he was. And again, look, I know everybody matures and gets bigger as they get older, but did you see the tweet that I'm referring to?
No, I did not.
All right. I don't know where it is. I'll have to see if I can find it. But anyway, Embiid was just incredibly skinny. So I think you know where I'm going on this. I don't see Embiid 5 years from now, based on his injury history, based on his body type, based on, again, the fact that the most important player in your franchise should be somebody that comes up big in playoff moments. Tyrese Maxey, 23 years old. I just think that his trajectory 5 years from now as a 28-year-old, he's going to be, even if Embiid is still playing at a relatively high level, I don't see 35-year-old Joel Embiid being a guy who is in the conversation for MVPs the way he is today. I would find it hard to believe he'd still be playing at an all NBA level at age 35. And Maxey, I don't know what Maxey's ceiling is, but he threw up a what, 27 and 6 this year. And I would anticipate that he's going to have another outstanding season coming up ahead of him. And when you're talking about a guy who 5 years from now is going to be 28 years old and presumably at the peak of his game, to me, I think it's a no-brainer to take Maxey over Embiid simply because of Embiid's lack of conditioning, his injury history, his lack of coming through in big moments. To me, all those things knock him down below Maxey when I start talking about who's the most important player 5 years from now for the Sixers.
Okay. All right. Toronto Raptors. I struggle with this one, but I feel like it has to be Scotty Barnes, right? Like
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's
it
anybody else
has to
that
be
you can
Scotty
even
Barnes.
consider.
I,
Yeah.
once again, I don't think Toronto is. If Scotty Barnes is your best player, I don't think Toronto is much of a contender. But I think Scotty Barnes is probably the most. I mean, by the way, when we're talking about all these teams, we obviously hypothesize if someone's making a big move in trades or whatnot. We're talking about as the rosters are currently constructed, because we know in the NBA the rosters in 5 years are going to look nothing like they're currently looking, unless you're the Cavs and you're just going to stick with the core four. I don't know, but I think it's got to be Scotty Barnes, and there's no one
Yeah,
else.
it
I
has
mean,
to be Barnes here. I think Toronto has kind of already made this bet, right? When you get
yeah,
rid of
yeah,
Siakam and you get rid of Van Vliet, who, not that those guys were super old, they didn't fit the Scotty Barnes timeline, but they're both in their late 20s when Toronto lets them walk in free agency to kind of reorient their team around Scotty Barnes. And then you look at the moves that they've made since then, and you bring in, I guess, the other guys that you could potentially argue for. Emmanuel Quickly, who they gave a nice big contract to after he came over from New York, and RJ Barrett, who had a really good sort of pre-Olympics and then Olympics with the Canadian national team. I still think, though, that if you look at it and you say, okay, if RJ Barrett or Emmanuel Quickly is the most important player on the Toronto Raptors in 5 years, then their plan has not gone the way that they would have anticipated. And Scotty Barnes hasn't developed into the kind of all around player that Masai Ujiri and the Toronto Raptors had hoped for. Look, I mean, Barnes, I don't think that he ever gets to the level of being a tier one guy that you can build around to win a championship team with him as your main guy. But if Scotty Barnes continues to develop as a shooter, he certainly has the size, the length, the feel as a passer. He does a lot of good things. I just don't know that he's ever going to be a guy who's going to be a first option superstar on a championship team. But he certainly has a better opportunity to do that than anybody else on this roster. I mean, even if you put him at the low end of his potential, he still is a very, even if he doesn't get any better from where he is today and he just matures, that's still a very, very good NBA player. I mean, you're talking Scotty Barnes could be one of your top three starters on a championship level team, even if he stays kind of just where he is right now.
yeah.
And I think he'll develop somewhat. I don't think he ever gets to maybe the highest level of his potential, but still, I don't see anybody else on this roster who carries the same amount of weight with this franchise as Scotty Barnes.
All right. Okay, so now we're gonna move to the Central, Mike. And I'm gonna be honest with you, the first team in the Central Division, the Chicago Bulls, they almost fall under the same category as the Brooklyn Nets. I looked up and I'm like, I don't know who's on this team 5 years from now. Like, I, I don't know. There's only one other team that I think is in a worse position than the Chicago Bulls, and it's the last team we're going to talk about. The note that I have for the Washington Wizard is this team is terrible.
Well, let's save the Wizards for the Wizards.
but
Give
but
me your thought process on the Bulls here. Or do you want me to go first on this one?
I'll let you go first. I like the I just really struggled with who on this roster do I want to say has if theoretically who build around this. I just don't see anyone. I don't see anyone.
Super flag.
I mean, he's not on the team right now.
I know, I'm just kidding. You could probably throw Cooper Flag out here for a few more teams as we move through the rest of the Eastern Conference. Now, I think when you look at this roster, so Zach Levine is going to be out the door. The chances of him being on the team 5 years from now are slim and none. And then you look at the rest of what they have. Your candidates are Patrick Williams, who was drafted number 5 overall and is still only 22 years old, but has never demonstrated anything in his 4 years in the league that would lead you to believe that he's going to ever become more than a serviceable role player. You have Kobe White, who 2, 3 years ago, I think people would have described him exactly the way I just described Patrick Williams as I'm not sure what Kobe White is. I'm not sure what he's good at. I'm not sure he's very good. And then this year kind of had a breakout season. And now you look at it and you say, okay, maybe Kobe White's the guy. And then, of course, this summer they make a trade and ship out Caruso and bring in Josh Giddey. And Giddey, 21 years old, a guy who's multidimensional, who can do a lot of things, very good with the ball in his hands because he has good vision. He has really good size. The knock on him has always been, can he shoot the ball and where do you play him defensively?
That's
But
the
I
only
think
knock
Giddey's
on
a
him.
very good player. Yeah, I mean, I think Giddey is a
He's
very, I think he's a very good player. He's a very good player. And the question with Giddey is, if you're giving him the ball and letting him kind of take the car keys, what's the ceiling of your team? And look, it's hard to know. A guy's 21 years old, whether or not he can get to the point where he's somebody that you want to have the ball in their hands for 60% of the possessions. I don't know if he gets there. I mean, to me, it comes down to the battle between Giddey or White. Which guy do you think is around for the long term? To me, I feel like I would probably lean Giddey just because I think Kobe White's a very good player, but I think Kobe White is more of a, to me, he's more of a scoring guard that plays off of somebody else. Giddey still feels to me like he could be a guy that if his shot ever developed, that he could become the lead ball handler on a pretty good team if you surrounded him with the right kind of lineup. And look, if you're Chicago and Giddey's the guy that we're talking about as the most important player in your franchise 5 years from now, I think Chicagoans would be somewhat disappointed. I think probably their most important player isn't on the roster now and probably isn't even in the league right now.
You're really hinting at Cooper Flag. I would probably say I would agree with everything you said. Like the only other guy that kind of like is like on my radar would be Patrick Williams, but he can't stay healthy. So I
And he hasn't shown anything. I mean, the sad part of this is that the Chicago Bulls should never be bad. I mean, they should be like the Lakers, where you think about A, the Chicago market, B,
the
just the
legacy.
amount of money. Yeah, I mean, the legacy, the amount of money that is in Chicago, just the size of the market. They should never, the Reinsdorfs should be, quite frankly, embarrassed the way that this franchise is being run. And it, I mean, every time I see the Bulls, it just feels like that team and that franchise should be a perennial winner. And the fact that they've been a perennial loser now for, I mean, it feels like forever. And you look at this roster, and there really isn't much prospects for them winning in any kind of big way. I mean, they're destined for, in all likelihood, the lottery. Maybe they compete for the 9, 10 spot at some point in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah.
But man, I just don't think the guy, if one of the guys that's on this roster is their most important player 5 years from now, either Josh Giddey has made a huge, tremendous leap, or the franchise is still just kind of floundering in no man's land where they've been for the last 10 years.
All right, we're gonna move to our Cavaliers now, Mike. It has to be Mobley. Mitchell.
Yeah, I agree.
It has to be Mobley. It's Mitchell. If he's still on the team in 5 years, that means we've won a championship
Or come real close.
or come really close.
And as we've
I
said
don't see.
numerous times over and over again, right? Evan Mobley is the key to
Yeah,
unlocking what this roster is right now. If Evan Mobley is only what he is now, which is a role player on offense and an outstanding defensive player, if that's all he is, it's still a very, very good player, but it doesn't take this roster, this particular group of players, that does not get this group to NBA title contention. Evan Mobley has to become, I don't know that he has to be a first tier superstar, but he certainly has to be a guy that is going to put up 20 points a game and 10, 11, 12 rebounds. He has to get to that Chris Bosh level of stardom. And he's offensively a long way from there at this point. But yes, he has to be the most important player 5 years from now, or again, you're looking at a complete retool if he's not.
yeah. All right, Detroit. It's got to be Cade Cunningham, considering they've just made a huge major investment in him, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that Cade is the guy here. Now, I have doubts
I have
whether or not
doubts too. I was just gonna say I have
I have
doubts
doubt. Well, no,
in
here's what I
the
mean. Here's
sense
what I
that
mean.
if
I don't.
in the sense that he can't be that guy. I mean, he's not proven it. He's also one of those guys who's getting paid a lot of money and he can't stay healthy. Like, and I don't know.
He has to
Is
be the
he?
guy. He has. I mean, he is the guy on this roster, but is he the guy that you need him to be if you're a Detroit Pistons
Yeah.
fan or you're I just don't I don't know. I think the jury is still out. I'm not sure what Cade Cunningham is, can be, will be, but he clearly is the only guy on this roster that you could even consider for being the most important player 5 years from now. I mean, there's nobody else that really ever could get there. I think Asar Thompson, again, could be an elite role player, but if he's your most important player 5 years from now, something has gone wrong. Jaden Ivey, we haven't really seen anything out of him that would indicate that he's ever going to get to that level. And there's really just up and down this roster. There's guys that are fine. There's guys that are going to play in the league for a while. There's guys that have ability, but Cunningham's the only guy that has the potential to be a franchise player. I don't know if he is or he isn't. Detroit is certainly going to find out in the next year or two whether he will become that or whether he's just going to be a good player in the league.
All right. Next team, the Indiana Pacers.
There's
I
only
mean,
one
if
choice here, right? I
yeah,
mean, it has to be Halliburton.
and he stay healthy? Can he play at the level that he played at the beginning of the season before he got hurt? There's no one else on this roster. I mean, that
There's nobody else
that
as young as him and as
yeah,
accomplished as him at this
yeah,
point. You know, I mean,
yeah.
Siakam has done a lot and he's made several all NBA teams, but by the time we get to 5 years from now, Siakam's going to be 34 going on 35. And there's really nobody else on this team that even comes close to what Halliburton and Siakam have done. And Halliburton, much younger, now an Olympic gold medalist. And as you said, I mean, the big question with Halliburton that we've been talking about since the injury, since the discussion of whether he'd make All NBA is which one of those Tyrese Halliburtons is closer to who he really is, the guy from last October and November, or the guy that we've seen since then who hasn't been nearly as dynamic or confident as at least as a scorer. So, I mean, I anticipate Halliburton's playmaking is always going to be right at the top of the league in terms of his ability to pass the ball and not turn it over. The big question for him is 5 years from now, as a 28, 29-year-old, what's he going to be doing offensively as a scorer? And there's just nobody else in this roster that's again close to him in terms of what he's accomplished, but also at such a young age.
Yep. All right. Milwaukee Bucks. I wrote Giannis and I put, is he still on the Milwaukee Bucks? Question mark.
Ooh,
because
I
I think
mean,
that's the most important. That's the most important part of this whole equation to me. I
absolutely. I
think
mean, the rest of this roster, there's nobody else. Everybody else on this roster who's any good is old. So there's no good young player on this roster that has done anything in the league to make you think that they could potentially be the most important player on any team in 5 years. So it has to be Giannis. Now, look, he could certainly be on another team 5 years from now. If you look at the roster of the Milwaukee Bucks today, it is a roster that is old and I guess built to win today with sort of mortgaging the future. But after this iteration of the Bucks is over, then you're either looking at a real rebuild, which by the time that happens, Giannis might be 31. Does he want to stick around for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it would
yeah.
take to sort of rebuild this team? Or does he opt to go somewhere else? I don't know. It seems unlikely that 5 years from now he would be on this team, but he still might be the most important player on the Bucks, even if he's not on the Bucks, either because they trade him and get back a bunch of stuff that they use to rebuild the franchise, or he walks in free agency and the Bucks roster and team is decimated for 3 or 4 years. So I think on the roster or off the roster, he's still probably the most important Milwaukee Buck 5 years from now.
All right. Now we're going to move to the southeast, Mike. Ox, and here's what I wrote. Trey. With the trade of Dejounte Murray, it signals the franchise is committed to Trey for the long term. Whether it pays off or not, is remains to be seen. But it has to be Trey. Just looking at this roster to me, with Murray gone, I think if Murray was
No.
still here, I probably would make an argument that maybe it is him because I just didn't see the long term implications for Trey Young if Dejounte Murray's on the team. But now that Murray's gone, seems like they're pretty committed to Trey Young. And Trey Young had that one playoff series against the Knicks, and since then he's been mediocre, appropriate. I mean, he's still great basketball player, but compared to the rest of his peers in the league, I mean, I would say that he's been mediocre. Um, but I still think it has.
I thought you were going to zag and go Windler.
He's also a guy he's injured.
So I'm going to zag and I'm not going to pick Trey Young. So I think it's their number one overall draft pick, Zachary Risache from France. Because if you have the number one pick and the number one pick does not develop into eventually your best player 5 years from now, I guess Risache is still only 24 years old. And maybe Trey Young, who at that point will be 30, maybe he's still the most important. But I think it's been proven at this point that you better have one heck of a roster, especially a roster full of defensive players around Trey Young if he's going to be your best and most important player. And I don't know, that seems tough to do. And to me, if you have the number one pick, that guy has to develop into your franchise player at some point. So even though Trey Young obviously has accomplished way more in his basketball career than Risache, I think that I'm going to go with Risache simply because, again, if you're a team that drafts a guy number one, you need that guy to look, and he's not going to be a LeBron, Anthony Davis type of number one overall pick, Wemby. That's not who he is. That's not what this draft was. But I still think that, look, if you mess that up the way the Cavs messed up Anthony Bennett, I mean, you're setting your franchise back a long way. And so I think Risache is the most important player 5 years from now for the Hawks.
Okay, makes sense to me. Uh, all right, Charlotte. I wrote LaMelo Question mark. I wasn't very confident with this answer, but I feel like it has to be LaMelo. And my note: can he become the player that his father and he thinks he can be? Can he be healthy and continue to grow as a player, or is he just going to keep playing the way he plays? He's going to continue to get injured. Um, I mean, I don't know who else on this roster is the guy. It's got to be him. Unless you're gonna tell me it's gonna be what's his the guy who was a
It's going to be Brandon. I'm going with Brandon Miller. I'm going to tell you it's Brandon Miller
he was so
because
bad last year.
who?
Brandon Miller.
Oh, what are you talking about?
I mean, I guess maybe I thought he was terrible, but maybe I'm wrong.
You're wrong. So, all right, Brandon Miller. Now, look, he wasn't a consensus rookie of the year. He wasn't di- so plays 74 games percent, 2.5 assists, 17 points a game. As a rookie who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, did he turn 20 yet? No, sorry, he's 21. So 21 years old. And I know LaMelo's only 22, been in the league for 4 years. And look, probably LaMelo's ceiling might be higher, but I'm going to be honest, my ship has sailed on the Ball family. Obviously, Lonzo, devastating injuries that just have not allowed him to get back on the floor. But at some point, if you're LaMelo, like you have to A, stay healthy, and B, be able to produce some degree of winning basketball. I mean, he's been there for, I believe this will be his, is this his fourth or fifth season? I think it's going to be his fourth season. And I mean, what has it led to for Charlotte? To me, the answer is nothing or next to nothing. And so I'm going to go with Brandon Miller. I think long term, he's a better bet to be your franchise player than LaMelo. And like I said, I think LaMelo might have a higher upside if all worked out perfectly, but I'm not sure that with the influence that he grew up under, plus the injury history, plus what we've seen of him to this point in the league, which again, he's an unbelievable passer at his size. There's no question he's an offensive talent that could be the guy kind of like we were talking about with Giddy, where he can have the ball in his hands. The question is if he has the ball in his hands for 60% of the possessions, what does that lead to? Whereas Brandon Miller, I don't know if he's ever going to develop into a number one lead guy. He's probably got to improve his playmaking. I see Brandon Miller, honestly, kind of almost in the mold of Tatum, where he might never get to the guy who just has the ball all the time and is orchestrating everything, but he might be a guy that averages 25 a game and can play really good defense on the other end of the floor. So I'm going to go with Miller simply because I feel like he's more of a, I don't want to say sure thing, but I feel like I know what I'm getting from Brandon Miller, whereas I feel like LaMelo is a complete wild card. So I'm going with Miller.
All right, me Heat. You want to guess what I wrote
I mean,
down?
this one has to be, I'm guessing you said Bam.
No,
No.
Eric Spolstra. Can he
Oh,
continue?
a
Can
little, a little zag. I like it.
can he
That's fair.
continue to win
That's fair.
despite not having the greatest legacy? Get a team to buy into the Heat culture. Can he continue to do all of these things? I mean, yes, Bam was on Team USA, but Jimmy Butler is injured consistently. Tyler Hero injured consistently. If they're all healthy, they're a solid team. But I mean, he basically took Kevin Love's corpse and gave him a role, and Love did a pretty good job. Um, I don't want to say he revitalized his career, but he was able to be functional. Okay, that team when Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero missed a majority of the season, made the playoffs, and then played. That's why I zagged. I say Eric Spolstra just because he seems to just get things out of people. So that's why I went Eric Spolstra.
I think that's probably a fair take in terms of level of importance for the consistency of this franchise. Eric Spolstra has been as responsible as anyone over this long period of time for Miami's success. So I'm not going to argue with you other than the fact that he's not really on the roster. But if I'm picking a player, I don't think this is probably one of the easiest teams to figure out. It's got to be Bam. I mean, everybody else is either old or unproven. So Bam to me turns 32 5 years from now. He's still going to be a very, 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 very good player. Never going to develop again into a guy who's going to have the ball in his hands, be making decisions, doing all those things. But with the all NBA level of defense that he plays, and he continues to expand his offensive game season by season, to me, this is a no-brainer that it's Bam. And although Spoelstra's not on the roster, I do agree that he's been hugely important in this franchise and the success that they've had. So I have no quibbles with Spoelstra being the most important person in the organization, just that he's not on the roster. So
All right. The next team's Orlando, and I don't think we have to hesitate. I think this isn't going to take a song to agree that it's Paolo. Right? Oh, you're hesitating. Oh, I lost you for a second there, Mike. I said Paolo
yeah,
Banchero for Orlando, right? Did you hear
yeah,
me
you're
say that?
breaking up. You've been breaking up a lot on my end. So hopefully the audio is coming through when it's being recorded there, because I'm missing a lot of your stuff. All right. Yeah, Banchero, I think it's a no-brainer in this one. I mean, there's really nobody else that you would consider. I guess if you really love Franz Wagner, you could try to make a case for him if you're a German. But otherwise, I think Paulo to me is clearly the guy that 5 years from now, he'll be 26 years old, just entering his prime. And clearly, if you're Orlando, it's funny. I was thinking about this today when you first brought this topic up, and I guess Orlando was the first team that popped into my head. And as I was thinking about Banchero, you just go back and you think about the discussion of who's going to go number one, who's going to go number two, who's going to go number three, and you look at that decision, and it seems clear that Orlando made the right choice. And then I think you look at Oklahoma City at number two, taking Chet, that was a really good fit. And look, Jabari's been good. I don't know though that Jabari has the ceiling, or at least people don't consider that he has the ceiling that Chet and Paulo have. So uh, for a decision that was as, I don't even know if controversial is the right word, but for a decision that was as debated as it was, I actually think the order of those three guys probably ended up being correct in Banchero, then Chet, and then Jabari. And all three of them are going to have excellent careers. So, yeah, I think Orlando, no brainer. Paolo is the guy.
All right. So the last team is the Washington Wizards, and as Mike, so I don't know who on the Washington Wizards you would say is the guy. I mean,
Johnny Davis. Johnny Davis?
oh, sorry, Mike. My internet completely went out there. I'm having major internet issues right now. I don't know what's going on. Johnny Davis, is that the guy you're going with?
I don't think I can go with John. I don't think I can go with Johnny Davis. I'm going to say that he's probably not the guy. I think, I mean, the sad part is you probably have, man. I mean, it comes down to two guys. I think, right? Though there's only two guys that could possibly be
Jordan
the
Poole.
guy that you would think. I would say not Jordan Poole, although Jordan Poole is 25 years old only. Maybe he can somehow resurrect his career. When you think about how important of a role he played for that Warriors championship team, it's kind of crazy how far his stock and just his game has dropped since then. But no, I don't think Jordan Poole is the guy. I mean, the first guy is the Frenchman they drafted last year, Koulibaly. I don't know what his ultimate potential is, but clearly he's an athletic 20-year-old guy who was drafted in the top 10. I think the consensus last year was that he was a guy who has potential to be what? I'm not 100% sure, but the potential to at least be a good player. And then the only other guy that you could consider is Alex Sarr, who was the number 2 pick in the draft this year, who put up an 0 for 15 during a game in summer league. But still, number 2 pick, 19 years old, 7 feet tall, has a range of skills. I mean, I think if you're the Wizards, you hope that 5 years from now that the most important guy on your franchise is Alex Sarr. And if you're not, you're probably, well, I shouldn't say that. You might be disappointed that Sarr isn't the guy, but you're probably excited because hopefully you get somebody else that surpasses the two guys who are already on the roster. So whether that's Cooper Flag or AJ DeBansta the next year, maybe you get Boozer's kid. I don't know who it will be, but Sarr and Koulibaly are the only real candidates that are on the roster right now.
This team is terrible.
Team is terrible. There's no question about that. I mean, I think what you're going to do if you're Washington, and look, the Wizards for a long, long, long time have been kind of stuck in mediocrity. And now you look at this team, funny because they have some recognizable names, some guys that, but I didn't realize Malcolm Brogdon was on the Wizards, by the way.
I, I, I
But
don't.
they have some functional NBA players. It's
Malcolm
just again
Brogdon's not the
they're not
guy,
very good.
Mike. Malcolm Brogdon's not the
No,
guy.
I'm not saying he's the no, I'm not saying he's the guy. I'm just saying they have Malcolm Brogdon, they have Marvin Bagley, they have Sadiq Bey, they have Jonas Valanciunas. I mean, they have Rashawn Holmes, they have Corey Kispert, they have Kyle Kuzma, they have Jordan Poole. Like they have some guys who have, I don't want to say done tremendous things in the league, but they have guys who have done things and been productive players in the NBA. I just don't know what this particular mix of dudes amounts to. And I think probably the answer is not much. And I think if you're a Wizards fan, you're hoping that it amounts to not much because this team is still looking for a superstar to be able to build around. And they've never been able to get anybody in free agency, which is kind of interesting because I would think that DC would be a popular place for young NBA players to live. But for whatever reason, it hasn't been a hotbed of free agency. So if you're the Wizards, you got to hope that in the next draft or two that you can somehow jump up into the top spot and grab a guy who's going to be your franchise player for the next 10 or 15 years. Because I think if your best player or your most important player is Sarr or Koulibaly 5 years now, from now, either something has gone tremendously right with one of those two guys, or more likely, the rebuilding plan has gone tremendously wrong. So
All right. So I think we've done it, Mike. We're finished with the Eastern Conference, despite my internet issues.
and we'll be back with the Western Conference next week. So that was an interesting just look at the rosters and kind of getting you to consider, well, what does it look like 5 years from now and who might be in that position? So I think that was a good exercise. Hopefully you enjoyed listening to it. And to everyone out there, we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks.